Question for the House on the adoption of the Majority Committee report of refer for interim study. The chair recognizes the member from Hampton, Representative Bean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important bill, and I thank the committee for their outstanding work in an examination of the blurb. They bring forth the salient points. And in the seacoast of New Hampshire, as a member of the Seacoast Cancer Cluster Investigation Committee, death has marched into the seacoast. It is the site of one of the few pediatric cancer clusters in the nation. There are two dead children, Sam and Lydia, and their parents have testified and provided tear-jerking testimony in our commission about that. These documents that are alluded to in the blurb are noted in the majority to be respected and not to be violated. They, in essence and in real fact, are the root cause and source of the continued malfeasance and mortality. The operating agreement, or the consent decree, is nothing but huge corporations, federal agencies, throwing pennies into a pot and walking away from the Coakley landfill group, which is a modern-day crime scene. The Coakley landfill group operating agreement, which has been challenged by the town of Hampton and our town attorney, is nothing more than an outdated cabal of an abdication of moral authority and responsibility to polluting the seacoast of New Hampshire. In a lesser concern, but very emphatic need of Hampton as our water source, we now have a 66 million gallon well that is shut down due to PFCs and PFOAs. I have personally been to Eversource with the government affairs attorney, have been in front of the Portsmouth City Council. We have opined, we have sent letters from our town attorney with the full majority of the Board of Selectmen in Hampton. We have talked to Mr. Sullivan. No amount of lobbyists, no respect for these sordid agreements and decrees will remedy the way. Your vote today to reinforce the good work of the committee that marginally in a 9-7 vote has said that this should not pass. Your vote on behalf of remediating that site, which has never been remediated, and moving past those terrible, terrible decrees and those terrible agreements will prevent future Sams and future Lydias. So I would ask you to respect the good work of the committee that almost got it right and overturn that majority and vote going forward that it ought to pass and a subsequent motion can be made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question for the House, the adoption of the Majority Committee report of refer for interim study. Chair recognizes the member from Hampton, Representative Cushing, to speak in opposition to the committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The highest point of land on our coastal plain between Seabrook and Portsmouth is Breakfast Hill. It's located in the town of Northampton, right near the Rye and Stratham line. In the 1950s, a gravel pit was opened there by the Coakley family, and they excavated a fair amount of gravel. And then turns out the bedrock was very close to the surface, so they decided also to blast out and extract the bedrock. And what remained was kind of a bowl on top of a hill on the seacoast. In the 1970s, there was a decision made to use that bowl as a solid waste and then hazardous waste disposal site. And that operated for a number of years. It took in hazardous waste and solid waste from all throughout the state. Took it from Pease Air Force Base, took it from the Navy Yard, took it from virtually every producer in eastern New Hampshire, and a lot brought up from Massachusetts. In the late 1970s, at the Lafayette Terrace, which is a small little housing development adjacent to Coakley, it turned out that there were people who were getting extremely ill, who had wells that turned out were polluted by the Coakley land, presumably by stuff leaking out of that landfill. Those wells were shut down, town water was introduced. In the 1980s, there was a lot of consciousness in this country about, coming in part from Love Canal, about the toxins that were below the surfaces that were threatening us. And the federal government established a Superfund project. The Coakley landfill in 1982 was declared a Superfund site by the federal government. And for the next 3 years, the state of New Hampshire allowed hazardous waste to be dumped on that Superfund site. Now, why the Department of Environmental Services in the 1980s decided to let more toxins be dumped on a Superfund site, I don't know, but it took place. In the 1990s, there was an agreement, a recognition that something should be done to clean up this hazardous waste site. And an agreement was structured between the Environmental Protection Agency, the responsible parties, who are the people who did the pollution, and DES, that provided to have this Superfund site cleaned up. I will note parenthetically that in 1980, the state of New Hampshire passed a law that required that all toxic waste and all sanitary and all solid waste sites have liners under them. This is 1980. Well, in the mid-1990s, when there was a decision made to clean up the Coakley landfill, a decision was made not to put a liner under it. But the decision that was made was, well, to put a cap on top of it to prevent further, to prevent stuff from leaking down into it on the top, and then to install a pump and treat system. The pump and treat system was a way that there would be a series of, there would be berms around the perimeter of the Superfund site, and there would be wells that would be in the middle of it that would extract water from the center of the Superfund site and treat that and release it. It would essentially be an ongoing process of cleaning up the Superfund site. And at the same time, there would be a restriction of development around the Superfund site because you didn't want to have new houses built there with new wells or other developments that would draw water out from underneath this cap. For some reason that we don't really know yet, although there was money was paid by the federal government to build the cap, and $5 million was also paid, contributed to install this pump and treat system. That pump and treat system was never installed. And so now, 25 years later, we've got a Superfund site that had a plan to clean up and make it and protect the health and safety of the public that never took place, and we have the emergence of a cancer cluster. And not only that, we have a problem, as my member from Hampton alluded to, that Superfund site is leaking, and it's leaking into the groundwater, away from the site, and into the drinking water of people in the surrounding towns. What the legislation before you does is direct the Department of Environmental Services to do what it said was going to be done 25 years ago, to clean up the site and to install that pump and treat system. And I know that with respect to the majority report, which alluded to some decision that this would violate the consent decree, I disagree with that. That's just not based on fact. If I can just read from the dissent decree, the notion is that the state of New Hampshire must have surrendered all its rights to protect the public health when it signed the consent decree. But the consent decree said that the state reserves all rights against the settling defendants. And this consent decree is without prejudice to all rights against the settling defendants, including but not limited to the following: liability arising from the past, present, or future disposal, release, or threat of release of waste materials outside the site. Now, when there was a seacoast cancer cluster The governor appointed a cancer cluster to look into reasons why there was a cancer cluster in the seacoast. One of the first things that the cancer cluster asked to have done is they asked to have the Coakley landfill tested for PFCs. There was an experience already in Pease where there were PFCs that were there that had been contaminated people. And although that had never been done, there was a compliance. There was a test for PFCs at the landfill, and guess what? Riddled with PFCs. There was then a request that was made to test the groundwater. And the state wouldn't do the groundwater. So at the instance of the member from Rye, who was not a member at the time, went out and sought a private individual to at least do testing on the groundwater. And the groundwater in Berries Brook, adjacent or nearby that landfill, showed that there was PFNAs, which were PFCs, that were at the time the third highest in the country that were detected. DES was suspect of that, so DES finally, a month later, did its own testing, and it came back and it said, oh yes, they were correct. There are PFCs leaking from this landfill site. They are amongst the highest in the world, and we'll acknowledge that. 4 months later, the Coakley Landfill Group did test, and they confirmed that, in fact, there are these highly toxic toxins leaking from the landfill site. Last July, in response to a letter that was submitted to our own DES by a number of seacoast lawmakers, our Department of Environmental Services confirmed that there were toxins leaking, there were toxins that were outside the Coakley landfill site, and it said that this is unacceptable and we're going to have to do something to clean it up. Well, that was last July. What this legislation does is it instructs the DES to do what it said needed to be done last July and to get on it right now. The state has the authority, retained the authority to exercise its power because the leaking, it's outside the site. The plan was, with a stipulation, is that the poisons and the toxins would be contained within the site. They didn't do what they said they were going to do. It's leaking now. It's a threat to the health and safety of the people in the seacoast. We need to stop talking, start acting. I ask you to defeat the interim study motion so that we can go on and pass this bill and start cleaning up Coakley. Thank you.
Question for the House is the adoption of the majority committee report of interim study. The chair. Members will please take their seats. The question before the House is on the adoption of the majority committee report of refer for interim study. If you're in favor of that, you should be pressing the green button. If you're opposed, you should be pressing the red button. Chair recognizes Representative Mesner for parliamentary inquiry. House will be in order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I know that the Coakley landfill represents a significant public health threat by contaminating groundwater, surface water, and drinking water of 5 towns of the seacoast, and I know that it has been 25 years of inaction. They took $5 million from the Department of Defense and never installed a remedial system. And if I know that the DES has said that this is a significant health issue, it threatens our public health of the seacoast, would I then press the red button so that another motion can be brought to pass this bill? Thank you.
Question before the House, the adoption of the majority committee report of interim study. If you're in favor of that, you should be pressing the green button. If you're opposed, you should be pressing the red button. All members voted, and hearing the question is put, the House will attend to the state of the vote.
should be all set.
There we go. 149 in the affirmative, 174 in the negative. The motion fails. Representative White.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move ought to pass on House Bill
Representative White
1766.
moves ought to pass on House Bill 1766. You ready for the question? A division has been requested. All members will remain in their seats. Roll call has been requested by Representative Cushing. I don't know. Schultz. Okay. It is sufficiently seconded. All members will please take their seats. Oh, some such? Okay. If all members voted here and the question is put, the House will attend to the state of the vote. 207 in the affirmative, 118 in the negative. The minority committee report is adopted.
Mr. Speaker?